Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor Shane Dark, and welcome to the weekly NDARC webinar broadcast, as always, live from the palatial ballrooms of Mars. Now, while we're widely dispersed, we acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, it is with great pleasure that I can introduce our speaker for this week, Dr. Amy Peacock, who is coming to us from the Hobart wing of the ballroom. Amy is a Senior Research Fellow at NDARC. She's the Program Lead for Drug Trends, which is a combination of various projects, including the Illicit Drug Reporting System, the Ecstasy and Related Drugs Reporting System, the National Illicit Drug Indicators Program, and the Drug and New Technologies Project. And as someone who's witnessed this from the beginning, I think it's fair to say that since we've set up the Drug Trends Program at NDARC in the mid-90s, it's grown to be the premier drug monitoring system worldwide. There simply is not the degree of triangulated data that in any other country. Today, Amy will be presenting on trends in cocaine, methamphetamine use, markets and harms in Australia. And it includes work that was actually published this very day in Drug and Alcohol Review, and as many will have seen, is widely reported in the media today. Now, as the viewers will be aware, the major shift in drug-related harm in Australia that occurred this century has been the increase in use of powerful psychostimulants such as methamphetamine. Amy's going to cover work from Drug Trends on emerging trends in these, in both cocaine and methamphetamine, and highlight the public health implications. I'm also delighted to say we'll be joined during question time by Associate Professor Rebecca McKeaton of NDARC, who is one of the world's leading experts on methamphetamine and stimulants more generally, for her perspective. Now, you may log questions on the Q&A Zoom function, which I'll relay to the speakers at the conclusion of the presentation. We may not be able to ask all of them. We've got a very big audience today, but I will do my very best. So now, Amy, it's over to you.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Shane. And thanks everyone for joining us today. As Shane mentioned, I'm going to be talking about findings in relation to trends in cocaine and methamphetamine use, markets and harms in Australia. So to start off with, I want to acknowledge a number of people who've contributed to the work that I'm going to be presenting on today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our funders, so the Australian Government Department of Health. I'd like to acknowledge the very broad team of people who contributed to the two projects that I'm going to be reporting on. And in particular, I'd like to highlight Dr. Nicola Mann. If there was a way I could put Nicola's picture up on this screen without her feeling incredibly uncomfortable, I would, to acknowledge that really I'm just standing here as a proxy for her and all the hard work that she has done. I'd also like to acknowledge the rest of the Drug Trends team, the fantastic data custodians who've shared their data and their knowledge with us, our participants where we have collected primary data, and also all those others who've supported the project. As Shane mentioned, the cocaine work that I'm going to be presenting on today was published today in Drug and Alcohol Review. The methamphetamine work that I'm going to be presenting on is currently under review, so crossing fingers, will be published very soon. If you would like to hear updates on that methamphetamine paper when it becomes available, or like to receive a copy of the cocaine paper, just get in contact with me. My contact details are at the end. So I don't want to spend this presentation too much talking about changes or talking about the background of cocaine and methamphetamine in terms of describing these drugs. But I do want to talk about the forms of them, just because it is important context, particularly when we consider what's happening globally. So focusing first on cocaine, there's really two main forms of cocaine that we talk about globally. So there's a powder form, and then there's the form that you'll hear referred to as base or crack cocaine. Now, it's that latter form that typically is of higher purity, and we see higher risk in terms of dependence and other harms that might arise from the use of that form. When it comes to talking about methamphetamine, we get a little bit more fancy. We break it down into 3 forms, at least in Australia. We talk about a powder form, which is often referred to as speed. We talk about it's a powder form, but if you look at that picture in the middle, it's a bit more waxy, oily, wet, that we often talk about as base or paste. And then the third form, which I'm sure you're all very familiar in hearing about, is the crystal form, which is often referred to as ice. And again, similarly, as you move down that list of forms, the purity of those forms generally tends to increase, and the risk of harms is escalated as well. Methamphetamine is a little bit of a tricky one in terms of talking about it today, in terms of distinguishing methamphetamines from the broader class of amphetamines. So firstly, just to give some context to people about Australia. So in terms of cocaine, let's go back to cocaine first. In terms of cocaine, powder is the main form we see in Australia. It's very rare to hear reports of crack cocaine, and I'll present some data to support that a bit later on. Sorry, going back to methamphetamine, in Australia, early 1990s, there was some legislative controls that meant that what we saw sold in Australia as methamphetamine, for the most part, is actually methamphetamine. There is some query around whether the powder form often contains methamphetamine, but so far it seems to be that it's mostly methamphetamine. So that's market composition. The next bit is terminology. So data sources are coded in terms of the drugs that are related to the event of concern, for example. And sometimes these data sources are coded at the amphetamine type stimulant level. So that would include things like pharmaceutical stimulants, it would include things like MDMA, as well as methamphetamine. So unfortunately, you're going to hear me swap a little bit between talking about methamphetamine and amphetamine type stimulants, depending on the data source. But we know that the market in Australia, for the most part, relates to methamphetamine. So for the most part, we're confident in saying that methamphetamine is driving a lot of the trends that we're talking about. To put Australia into a global context, so these are data from the World Drug Report that have been mapped by Michael Farrell in his recent paper in The Lancet. So we have an indication of the prevalence of cocaine use, and then an indication of the rates of cocaine dependence. And you can see in the map around cocaine use, Australia is quite a nice, bright red colour, looking quite similar to North America. So we do see quite high rates of cocaine use in Australia. When we turn to look at dependence, we see high rates of cocaine dependence, but not necessarily on the same level as North America. Moving to look at amphetamines. So Australia is one of the countries that does have higher rates of amphetamine use globally. And then moving to look at amphetamine dependence, we particularly stand out in terms of our rate of amphetamine dependence in Australia. I really want to quickly highlight some information around seizures internationally as well, because it relates to why we thought these papers were so important to pursue. So as you can see, we have the global quantity of cocaine seized over time. It is broken down by region, and then we have the global quantity of amphetamine type stimulants seized by law enforcement. And you can see that nice increase over time for both of those substances. So that global context of reports of increasing production, increasing importation of these substances does raise concern for us in Australia, because we do have relatively high rates of use and dependence of these substances. So the temptation here was for me to start going into the Australian data, but that's the chunky bit of the presentation. So I want to take a step back and talk about drug trends, which Shane alluded to earlier. So drug trends, it's a national surveillance system that's been running for over 2 decades in Australia. And essentially what we do is we use different data sources to try and identify emerging trends in drug use, drug markets, and drug harms. Now, in terms of the types of data we use, So some of the data we collect ourselves. So we have the illicit drug reporting system and the ecstasy and related drugs reporting system, and that's where we do annual interviews with people who regularly use drugs across Australian capital cities. We also access a range of data sources that are collected by other people in the course, so routinely collected administrative data. And for the presentation today, I'm just going to be focusing on the two types of data that you see highlighted in green. So our interview data and also our national secondary data that we access. So when I talk about bringing together lots of data, what does that actually mean? So you'll hear me talk about triangulation, and this has been a core feature of the drug trends program for 2 decades. Now, I'd love it if there was one definition for triangulation when you look it up in the dictionary, but unfortunately it seems to vary depending on where you look. But the basic crux of it is looking at multiple data sources alongside one another in relation to a single research question to see what the patterns are like across those sources and use it to inform public health decisions. So why is it better to look at lots of different data rather than just one data source? Well, by looking at lots of different sources, it means that we can increase the validity of what we're seeing. So say, for example, I have one data source that talks about price of cocaine and another one that similarly indicates in some way price of cocaine. If both of those data sources are showing the same trend, it makes us feel more confident that what's happening, what we're seeing in the data, is potentially a true reflection of what is occurring more broadly in the market, I guess. So it increases the validity, it increases the credibility, but also by having more data, and you can tell I'm a person that loves having lots of data, or you will by the end of this presentation. By having more data, we can look more at the nuances of those trends as well. So how do we go about triangulation? Just like there being lots of definitions, there's lots of approaches to it, but essentially often it's about drawing on existing data that are collected over time relating to a single research question. So today we're going to be triangulating data across various sources that tap into indicators of use, markets, and harms. And in terms of bringing the findings from those sources together, it can be tackled in a number of different ways as well. So it can be synthesized qualitatively, so you can look at it and describe it across the data sources, or there are quantitative methods that you can use as well. And if you want a sales pitch beyond what I've already done about why we should be looking at lots of data sources together, there is a commentary that's been published just in the last week or so that talks more about why we should be focusing on lots of different data sources in the alcohol and drugs field. So before I kick off, I would like to just acknowledge some caveats to the work I'm going to be presenting. So we've drawn on lots of different data sources. I'm going to show you a slightly overwhelming table that lists all of those sources, but there are other sources that potentially tap into the indicators of interest that we couldn't access to present on today. So I would encourage people to look to those other sources as well. We are subject to the limitations of each data source. There is no single data source that is perfect in measuring an intended outcome. In saying that, the advantages of triangulation is that you're drawing together different data sources, and the hope is that by bringing them together, you're essentially diffusing the limitations of each individual data source to create strength in your conclusions. But if people are interested in the limitations of the individual sources, the paper I referred to that was published today has a table that goes into them in great depth. I'll talk more about the analysis approach, but we used one analysis approach for this, for these pieces of work. We modeled it different ways, but essentially what I would like to say is if you applied a different analysis approach to these data, you may find a slightly different finding. So keeping that in mind, that the approach we chose we thought was best suited to the data that we had available, but there could be alternative findings with different analysis approaches. All of the data I'm going to be presenting on are national. So unfortunately, I know that the jurisdictional data is often the most interesting, but unfortunately, I can't talk about what's happening at the state and territory level in Australia. And then the final caveat is that I hope you're still awake at the end of this. By definition, triangulation means lots and lots of data, which in turn means lots and lots of figures. So I'm going to try and minimize the number of figures, or at least make them interesting. But unfortunately, you're in for a bit of a journey through figures. So let's start with cocaine, because that was the piece of work we really kicked off with. So as I mentioned, the overwhelming table of data sources, this is mostly to give you an idea of the array of sources that we were using and the features of them. So we were predominantly looking at data that was collected from 2003 to 2019. We were looking at data, some of which was self-reported. So the first two rows are data that's self-reported by the general population and by people who regularly use drugs, all the way through to data that is routinely collected in the course of people accessing healthcare services. So there's a range of sources that we're drawing on here. Now, the analysis approach. I'm going to try and describe this at the level that I understand it at, and that Nicola might be potentially ashamed of me for doing it at. But essentially what we did was an autoregressive time series analysis with a lag of 1 year to detect the trend and change in the trend using a Bayesian framework. So to talk about this, so essentially what we did is for each data source, we ran 3 different models and then assessed which of those models had the best fit to the data. And I've done a very crude depiction of what each of those models look like. So model 1 is essentially testing for no slope. And what I mean by that is there was no change over time. Model 2 was testing for one slope with no change point. Now I've put it going upwards, it could be going the other way, but essentially looking to see if there's a continual increase or decrease over time. The third model is one change point with 2 slopes. So essentially what we were doing was looking to see, is there an inflection point in the trend? And what is the change before that inflection point and after that inflection point? So that's my introduction to Bayesian analyses, or at least the ones used here. So let's start to look at the data. So the first source we're going to look at is the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. So this is a survey that attempts to look at prevalence of drug use in the Australian population, the Australian adult population. So we didn't actually run change point analysis for this in our data source because it's collected every 3 years, so there weren't sufficient data points. But essentially what I want you to look at is this continuous black line. So this is the percentage of the adult population that report any use in the past year. And essentially it has increased over time, and particularly in the more recent years, so from the 2016 to the 2019 survey. Looking at this, you can see that use is consistently higher over time among males as compared to females, and among people who are aged 20 to 29 as compared to other age groups. Now, I don't want to just focus on any use within a time frame. What's really important to talk about is frequency of use. And for cocaine, we are seeing in more recent years a small increase in the number of people reporting higher frequency use. So of those who said they'd used in the last year, 10% in 2016 said they'd use weekly versus around 17% in 2019. So we are seeing a bit of an uptick there. Next, we move on to the ecstasy and related drugs reporting system. So this is annual interviews that we conduct with people who regularly use ecstasy and other illicit stimulants. So they are engaged in the stimulant market. So essentially what we found was model 3 was the best fit for this. So what I mean is there was one change point with 2 slopes. So how that translates is we saw that the percent reporting any use increased by around 0.5% until 2017. and then we saw it increase by around 6.1% each year the year after. So really that increase is concentrated predominantly in the most recent year, even though it has been going up generally over time. Coming back to that point around frequency of use has remained consistently low in this sample, even in the most recent years. And again, that point around the forms used in Australia, we see less than 1% of people who report cocaine use saying that they'd used the crack form in Australia. So it really is overwhelmingly the powder form that we see in Australia. That same sample, we asked them about the availability of, so how available do you think cocaine is, or how available is cocaine at the moment? And they can respond very difficult, difficult, easy, very easy, don't know. So what we've got here is the percentage of those who commented who said it was easy or very easy to obtain cocaine. And essentially the best fit for the data was model 2, so a relatively continuous increase over time. So we saw it increase by around 1.2% each year who said cocaine was easy or very easy to obtain. Interestingly, when we asked people about the last price they paid for cocaine per gram, so back in 2003, it was around $250. By 2006, it was $300. And since then, it has sat relatively stable over time. We haven't seen a change in price over the years. The next data source is law enforcement seizures. So these are national cocaine seizures. Essentially what we saw here when we looked at both number and weight was that the model 2 was the best fit for the data in terms of one slope with no change point. So a general steady increase over time in the number of cocaine seizures, and similar recorded for weight. Now, when looking at this figure, you'll see that there's these lovely shading towards the end of the figure. This means that there's a high degree of variability in the data, and we really do need to be quite cautious in interpreting this seizure data. Moving to look at arrests, very similar picture to seizures in terms of a steady increase over time in the number of cocaine related arrests. So we've covered use, we've covered markets, now moving to look at harms. So what we've got plotted here is from the National Hospital Morbidity Database that's held by Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And we looked at the rate, or the age standardized rate of hospitalizations where cocaine was the principal diagnosis, or where cocaine poisoning or mental or behavioral disorders appeared in any of the diagnosis fields. And there's up to 100 diagnosis fields in hospital records. What we found was model 3 was the best fit, so one change point. So to break that down, essentially what we saw was that prior to 2011-12, there was relatively little change in the data over time. From that point onwards, though, we see that it increased by around 1.3 episodes per 100,000 people per year. That line here looks relatively dramatic given the access, but just to put it in context, in 2017-2018, there were around 1,000 hospitalizations where cocaine was the principal diagnosis. So that equates to around 1.7% of all drug-related hospitalizations in Australia in that year. Moving now to look at treatment, it was a similar model fit. So what we found in terms of treatment episodes, and this is from data also held by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So looking at principal drug of concern, it was relatively stable up until 2016-17, at which point we saw it increase by 2.9 episodes per 100,000 people per year. This was a decent jump for cocaine treatment episodes, and when we broke it down, we found that it was relatively consistent across jurisdiction, across treatment type, across referral type. We talked with AHW about this, and for the most part, we're fairly confident that this is not a consequence of changes in coding practices, that it is a legitimate reflection of what we're seeing in the data and in the real world. Again, just to bring it back into context, so it's around less than 1% of treatment episodes that relate to cocaine in terms of the total treatment episodes in 2017-18. Finally, to look at deaths, the rate of deaths is quite low in Australia for cocaine. So we found that it was a relatively stable trend in terms of cocaine over time. And just to give you, again, some context, it's around, well, less than 20 deaths or drug-induced deaths that are attributed to cocaine each year in Australia. And in terms of cocaine involvement in deaths, it's around 50 to 60 deaths where we see cocaine noted as being contributory. So overall, what we're seeing that there are some significant shifts in cocaine use, markets and harms in Australia in recent years. And I particularly emphasise from around 2016, 2017 onwards. So what we're seeing are increases in indicators of availability. So as I said, people reporting that cocaine's easy or very easy to obtain. We also use things like seizures and arrests as an indicator of availability. We're also hearing about reports of increases in use in cocaine in the sentinel populations and our general population data. So that includes our sample who regularly use ecstasy and other drugs, other stimulants. We're also seeing indicators of increases in harm. So thinking back to the hospitalizations data, where we've seen an increase in recent years. And then also indicators of increases in help seeking, as I talked about, particularly in the last year or two for the treatment episodes. Now, this does align for the most part with other data sources that weren't included in these analyses. So this is hot off the press data from the National Wastewater Monitoring Project. So this report was released today. And looking at cocaine, you can see that there's, for the most part, quite a nice increase over time from 2016 up until October 2020. And reflecting, I haven't really gone into this, but you can see that it's much higher in terms of capital city areas as opposed to regional sites. So where are we going with cocaine given what we're seeing in the last few years? So I guess I've presented what could be interpreted as a pretty concerning picture around cocaine in terms of increasing use, increasing harms, increasing help seeking, greater availability. But I think there's a few other things we need to keep in mind. So one is, for the most part, we're not seeing frequency of use really skyrocket. When we talk to people who use ecstasy and related drugs, they're typically reporting using cocaine monthly or less in the last 6 months. So frequency of use is remaining relatively stable over time. The thing that worries me, well, not worries me, but I'll be interested to see with frequency of use is whether we see a drop in price. So as I said, in Australia, the price that we see reported by people who use cocaine has remained stable since around 2006. So it's about $300 a gram, which is quite high relative to international standards. So if we saw a decrease in price, I'd be interested to see whether we then started to see a jump up in frequency of use, even knowing that we are hearing reports of increased availability at the moment. The other thing to flag, as I mentioned, we're talking about powder cocaine in Australia. And when we talk about powder cocaine in Australia, not to speak disparagingly, but when you look at the analysis of that powder cocaine, it's typically quite low in terms of purity, or variable rather in terms of purity. And we haven't seen a major change in that as well. So that could be another factor that determines what we see with trends going forward. Finally, I mean, we have just had, these data were all prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Another project, we've just released a bulletin from today from the Australians Drug Use Adapting to Pandemic Threat Study. And when we talk to those people about their use of cocaine in the past month relative to before COVID-19, for the most part, people have said we've interviewed them at 3 time points. And for the most part, they've said their use in the past month is stable compared to what it was before COVID-19, but there are a decent proportion who reported decreases in use. So it will be interesting to see what happens moving forward following on from the pandemic in terms of patterns of use around cocaine as well. In terms of the priorities moving forward, well, always going to argue for continued surveillance. And I think the situation that we're in at the moment definitely warrants continued surveillance in terms of the capacity for this to escalate. I think the thing that is somewhat concerning is the lack of effective treatment options for cocaine at the moment, and the need for significant investment if things do escalate for cocaine. But particularly around harm reduction, that may be where we need to concentrate some of the effort, particularly seeing those increases in hospitalizations, focusing on supporting people in terms of potentially less risky patterns of use. So I promise the next bit will be shorter. So moving on to look at methamphetamine use and markets and harms in Australia. Now, I know I didn't give you a bit of background for cocaine, but methamphetamine's got a bit more of a complicated history in Australia. So I just want to give you a little teaser. So we've had a number of claims of an ice epidemic in Australia. So the first one really came about around 2006, 2008. And at that time, there was mobilisation around it. There was, we saw the national amphetamine type stimulant strategy. And I think arguably it could be said that there was significant investment, predominantly concentrated from a law enforcement perspective. Then there was a second period of concern. So that really kind of escalated from around 2012, 2013. And it was around 2015 that we saw things really start to kick off in terms of public concern. So there was the National ICE Task Force, the National ICE Action Strategy. We've seen jurisdictional inquiries into methamphetamine since then. And again, there's been quite a bit of investment in methamphetamine in the period since, so kind of 2015 onwards. And that investment has, in some part, been concentrated on drug treatment. But we haven't really seen what's happened with methamphetamine since 2015. So the reason I've put these two papers up here is this is not the first effort to triangulate data on methamphetamine in Australia. So Louisa and Degenhardt and co. Published a paper back in 2008, where they drew on various data sources to look at what was happening in methamphetamine around that first period of concern, and identified some very interesting findings, particularly in relation to the law enforcement data. And then around that second period of concern, similarly, Louisa had done some triangulation work around 2015. So we wanted to build on this existing work to see what the trend was like over time, but in particular, concentrate on the more recent years. I'm not going to go through this table again. The only reason why I'm showing it is to say we looked at lots of data, but also, as I mentioned before, in terms of this last column, going back to that point of methamphetamine, amphetamine type stimulants, I've put the definitions there, and I'm going to try and keep relatively consistent to them throughout this rest of this presentation across the sources. And the analysis approach. You don't need to go into Bayesian again, but I just need to flag one thing really quickly. Because we knew there were two significant periods of concern around methamphetamine, we tested more change points. So model 3, as I talked about before, was just testing one change point. Now we have 3B, which tests to see whether there are two change points, and model 3C that tests to see whether there are three change points with slopes. So we actually ran 5 models for each data source, which is why Nicola deserves all the credit for this, because there's a lot of models. Back to the household survey. So methamphetamine use, in terms of any use in the past year, has actually really been declining over time in Australia. It's when you go into the nuance of that data in terms of consumption patterns that things get quite interesting. In that around 2013, we saw an increase in the percentage of people who report use of methamphetamine who said they were using it more frequently. It's remained relatively stable since then. And we also saw an increase in the percentage of people who reported crystal as their main form from that point in time. again, remaining relatively stable subsequent. With our sample of people that we talk to who regularly use ecstasy and other illicit stimulants, now I know there's a lot of things being presented on this figure. The squares, the black squares that aren't filled in, this is the percentage reporting any use in the past 6 months. And then the black squares that are filled in is the percentage reporting weekly or more frequent use. And in this case, we actually analysed weekly or more frequent use. Now, model 2 was the best fit in terms of a steady decline over time in this sample, which actually aligns with the household survey, but is a little bit contradictory in terms of what I was talking about before, in terms of increasing concern around methamphetamine. What is notable here, though, is if you go back to the early years when we were asking people about methamphetamine in this sample, overwhelmingly, they were telling us about powder or speed, and crystal wasn't really featuring as part of their methamphetamine use repertoire, I guess you'd say. By 2019, though, there's really not that much difference in terms of the use of powder and crystal. So while methamphetamine use has declined over time, we see a convergence, I guess, of the powder and the crystal form. This is a new data source that I didn't show in relation to cocaine, because cocaine is not really used in this sample. But this is a sample of people we interview across capital cities each year who regularly inject drugs. Again, with the black unfilled squares is the percent reporting any use in the last 6 months, and we analysed the percent reporting weekly or more frequent use. And the model that best fit this data was a single change point. Now, what that looks like, and you can see it for yourself, there was somewhat of a, well, we'd call it relatively stable in terms of the percentage reporting use up until 2011. And from there, we see an increase in the percentage reporting weekly or more frequent use. Similar to the previous sample that I talked about, well, powder was relatively common among this sample in the early years, but from around 2011 onwards, it's very rare for us to see this sample reporting use of the powder form. Crystal is really what's driving this trend, and in particular driving the trend of higher frequency use. So with the sample who inject drugs, like last time, we asked them about the price paid per point, so of crystal and powder methamphetamine. And it's interesting that the trend for powder and crystal really quite closely aligns over time. So we actually found that 3 change points best fit this data. So it was relatively stable up until 2009. Then we saw it increase by around, this is for crystal, for around $15, $16 per point per year until 2011. It then plateaued until around 2017, and then a smaller magnitude decrease. It was around $5, $6 per year that we saw it decline. And as I said, very closely mimicked by what we see with powder. Again, quite a lot of variability in the seizure data, so I just recommend some caution in looking at this data. This is when things get quite complicated, when there's 3 change points. But essentially what you can see happening if we look at the number is that it was increasing, so around 1.16 times, then decreased, then increased, then plateaued. Similar findings for weight of seizures, similar finding for arrests. So quite an interesting pattern over time. Moving now to look at harms. Again, 3 change point model cropped up again. So what we saw was that there was somewhat, when we look at, principal diagnosis, relatively stable, potentially a very slight decrease over time up until around 2009, 2010. It then increased by around 4.8 hospitalizations per 100,000 people until 2013-14. You can see in both these lines, it got steeper from around 2013-14 and has since plateaued, potentially slight decline. And amphetamines, so sorry, I should say we're talking about amphetamine type stimulants here. They do account for a decent proportion of the total drug-related hospitalizations that we're talking about. So it's around 14,000 hospitalizations in Australia in 2017-18. Moving to look at treatment episodes, a slightly more simple approach or simple outcome. So the treatment episodes, they were declining somewhat until around 2010, 2011. And then we saw an increase of around 19.5 episodes per 100,000 people per year when we look at the principal drug of concern. So that quite nice steady increase over time since around 2010-11. And amphetamines really do play quite a significant role in terms of drug and alcohol treatment episodes in Australia. So they make up around a quarter of the treatment episodes in terms of where amphetamines are identified as the principal drug of concern. Finally, moving to look at deaths. So when we look at the amphetamine-induced deaths, they were relatively stable until around 2012. And then we did see an increase from then onwards till around 2016. Now, that point or the trend from 2016 might look promising in terms of it being a flatter line. Now, the caveat to that is that the data from 2016 to 2018 is not yet finalised. The estimates are still being revised, and unfortunately, they will only go upwards from here. So that will be interesting to see. So I don't know if you, I don't know if you feel like me, but when we sat down and looked at those analyses, I felt a little bit like I got to the end. I don't know, Dr. Seuss book. Anyway, it's a great story, but you need to pull it all together. It's a lot of information. And this is where I think triangulation is so important. So I appreciate this figure is a little bit complex, but let me talk it through. This is a great figure visualization that Nicola has prepared. So essentially what we're seeing here is each of the indicators that I've just talked about mapped in one figure. And what is shown here is the annual percent change. So if the color is white, it means that there wasn't really much change in that year. If it's red, it means it was increasing. If it's purple, it means it was decreasing. So looking at that first period, for the most part, going by color, you can see that there were indications of increases in the law enforcement indicators, so seizures and arrests. For the most part, we're not seeing increases across the other data sources. So that's kind of mapping onto that first wave of concern. The next significant period that we identified from looking across the sources is actually from 2009, 2010 onwards. As you can see, we're starting to get a bit of an increase in the percentage of people reporting higher frequency use amongst our sentinel samples. Seizures and arrests are starting to creep up. Hospitalizations are increasing, treatment episodes are increasing, and deaths are increasing to some degree as well. But as I mentioned at the beginning, what we really cared about was what's been happening since, or in these most recent years, since there has been quite a bit of investment around methamphetamine and public health response. And it is quite interesting looking across here at what has happened. So yes, we're still seeing some degree of increase around that higher frequency use amongst our sentinel samples, but for the most part, in terms of law enforcement data, it's kind of plateaued, if not decreased. Hospitalizations have potentially plateaued, if not decreased. Deaths, as I mentioned, we're still waiting for the final data, but no indications of an upward inflection there. If anything, it's just that the treatment data is still ticking upwards. So to pull that all together, so that first major period of concern I talked about, so around 2006, 2008, in the data that we analysed here, in the way that we analysed it here, it was signalled predominantly by an increase in police drug seizures and arrests. We didn't necessarily see it play out in the other data sources, but that's I think potentially a reflection of the types of trends that were occurring at that time, in that we were seeing certain populations of people who were using drugs more, a shift to crystal form, and so on. The second major period of concern, so around 2012, 2013 onwards, we do see manifest in these data, but actually the data not predates, but we see the change occurring, say, a year, 2 years earlier. So we're seeing greater dominance of the crystal form, increases in frequency, increases arrests and seizures, increases in harms as well. And the things that really picked it up quite early on was the sentinel data with people who regularly use stimulants. We saw that appear quite early on, and also the hospitalizations and treatment episodes started to tick upwards quite early on. And then, as I said, particular interest. So in terms of what's been happening since 2015, 2016, for the most part, it does seem to suggest a continued demand and sustained market for methamphetamine in Australia. Seizures are remaining relatively stable. People are saying the price is relatively stable from memory. And there's still people using at a relatively high frequency. What's interesting is that, particularly when we look at hospitalizations, we aren't seeing them going up in the more recent years. So maybe it might be suggestive of a plateauing in harms, but looking at the updated deaths data will be really important. And what is interesting is that we do continue to see increases in help seeking as evident by the treatment episodes. That could be taken to be a good message, and it is likely a good message, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who wants treatment that more people who want treatment are getting treatment, essentially. So because of the increases in frequency of use, it's likely that we're seeing more people reporting problematic use. And just because the rate of treatment episodes is going up doesn't necessarily mean that the coverage is going up. So that's something we do need to investigate, and also continue to explore investment in treatment in terms of exploring treatment options for methamphetamine. So I'm going to call it a win for triangulation, even though hopefully you're awake and not asleep after looking at all of those figures. By drawing together all of those data sources, it's helped us get a better picture of what's happening with methamphetamine and cocaine in Australia, and hopefully we can continue to update and look at these approaches for other drugs as well. And I'd just like to thank you for listening, and if there's any queries or anything I can help out with, there's all the contact details. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Amy. I'll just get you to stop sharing the screen, and we'll get Professor McKeaton to put her camera and mic on. There she is.
Hello, everyone.
By a crystal stream.
I'm calling in from the Never Never.
Yes. Thanks very much, Amy. I mean, I think that shows the value of triangulation. Before we move on, there's a statistical question. Well, I think you answer it. Jason Ferris has made a couple of comments. He does say, I should say, great approach to singularizing the 13 data sources across time. That was your shades of grey type of thing, which is very good. He did ask for the cocaine. Did you test for only the one join point, like one trend? Because in the methamphetamine you had rather more complex. He was just asking, did you look at anything where there might have been more than one point where everything inflected?
Yeah, good question, Jason. So no, we only did test one change point for the cocaine data. That was partly from visual inspection of the data. We thought that one change point was appropriate, but also, I mean, I will be honest, we became more sophisticated as we went on. So cocaine was the first piece of work we did, and methamphetamine was the second, which is why you got that nice summary figure at the end for methamphetamine. I mean, there is the capacity that we would find more change points there, but yeah, visual inspection did seem to suggest that the one change point would be appropriate.
Work for that.
Yeah.
Great. throw this over to you, Rebecca. It's a question from Urmila Sriskanda. And I think it's a general question on purity of drugs that I know you've done a lot of work on. Urmila says there's concern that MDMA, ecstasy, less pure forms of the drug may be more dangerous or risky. I'm not familiar with that particular data, but she's asking, is this also true for cocaine? And I think we could look at meth as well. The relationship between drug purity and harm, I think, is the question here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. With MDMA, the issue around purity is around it's different than for cocaine and methamphetamine. With MDMA, the concern around purity is whether you're actually getting MDMA or you're getting another compound which might be psychoactive but might also be toxic.
Yeah.
So it's more poisoning from other constituents that have been inadvertently included in the tablet because someone hasn't made the MDMA properly, or they've decided to put something else in there. With both cocaine and methamphetamine, it's less of an issue. Usually it's cut with adulterants that are fairly innocuous. So they're intentionally put in there. They're not meant to be harmful. And it's not necessarily the case that the adulterant is going to do any harm. I'm not saying that it doesn't mean that in the rare occasion there aren't adulterants that might do harm, but by and large, it's not the adulterants that are causing the problem. It's actually the opposite. We tend to see with higher purity forms, we get more harm, just simply because it's, I make the analogy often that it's like whiskey versus beer. You're getting a stronger dose, so you're more likely to get drunk and fall over. It's the same with cocaine and methamphetamine.
So there's higher risk of acute effects, but also, I know from your work, higher risk of dependence.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon that we have seen with the higher purity forms, a higher risk of dependence as well. And again, it makes sense. You're taking more of it on each occasion.
Yeah, you see the same for heroin, by the way. The adulterants are typically sucrose, and higher purity is associated with a greater dependence potential. I'll throw this over to you, Amy, from Michael Sanders. Does the plateau in the third section of the triangulation table? My head's spinning, by the way, so I'm hoping you know which section that Michael's talking about. I'm sure you do. Yeah. Indicate that it has plateaued at the higher, like second band of levels. Has it plateaued at a higher level rather than declined and plateaued?
Yeah, I mean, that is what it seems to suggest. So from around 2010, 2011 onwards, for some of the harms indicators of things like hospitalizations and deaths and whatnot, we have seen them go up over time. And then from around 2015, 2016, it's relatively stable. There is some indication of a decline in hospitalizations, but the magnitude is quite small. So yes, we are sitting roughly around a point where, we're reflecting an escalation prior to those years. But that's where I think, looking at the deaths data and the next few years, I think will be very interesting in terms of which direction things tend to go.
Yeah. I mean, as a general rule of thumb, more use means more harm. By definition, for the types of things Rebecca was talking about, more use means more people exposed to risk. Now, I'd like to actually throw a question over to Rebecca. Rebecca, just with that in mind and looking at, say, the increases or the higher plateau, the whole issue of methamphetamine use and cocaine use in this country begs the question of treatment responses. Now, really, the resi rehabs have had to bear the brunt really of that, and they do a great job. But I know you've done a lot of work looking at pharmacotherapies, and I just wonder if you could make general comment on where we are at with potential pharmacotherapies.
So I mean, we've had a frustrating time with the development of pharmacotherapies for stimulant use, both for cocaine and methamphetamine use. There's been a lot of trials that have been done in this area, particularly for cocaine use. and less so for methamphetamine use. They haven't pulled up particularly good results. In fact, we're still in a situation where we don't have any proven effective treatments. We don't have any drugs approved by our Therapeutic Goods Administration for treating stimulant use. The only evidence we have at the moment is for cocaine, not so much amphetamine. Very poor quality evidence of a weak potential benefit of providing other stimulant drugs for cocaine dependence. But the evidence is so low quality that we can't rely on it. And I think that is a problem across the board. A lot of our clinical trials on stimulant use, and I'm sorry, this is a bit boring and methodological, but they have such high dropout rates that they're really biased. And so at the moment we're kind of stuck that we don't have a good solution. It actually brings me back to a question I had for Amy. I don't know if we've got other questions, but
no, please. Amy's crying out for a question there. I can see it.
I mean,
Make it hard, Rebecca. Make it difficult.
Well, Amy did say before the presentation she'd cry if I mentioned Bayesian modelling, so I won't do that. It's okay. But
I'll cry.
To me, I mean, I think the story here is the cocaine, and I want to get a better handle on that because historically Australia's been fairly protected from cocaine because of its geographic isolation, and a lot of cocaine use in North America is produced in Peru or whatever. In contrast, we've had a long history of methamphetamine use. We have a good domestic supply of methamphetamine. We're getting it imported from Southeast Asia. It's been a really strong and established market. When we have seen cocaine in Australia, it's been fairly circumscribed to the cities, as Shane has said. And when we've seen it historically, the trends have also been fairly circumscribed. Like we had an issue with it in the late 90s, and by the time we caught up with it, it was over or it petered out. Is this the real thing? Is this the new kid on the block? Is it going to take over from methamphetamine? When we talk about increases in treatment demand in an absolute scale, where does it sit in the picture? Are we going to get a displacement of our stimulant market?
Because they are competing products.
Are they different markets?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Amy, have you got any general comment on prognostications? Where are we going to be
Rebecca, you're asking me to start forecasting now. We won't go.
Where are we going to be in 2030?
No, I think it's a good point. So as I was mentioning, when we look at cocaine, I mean, every hospitalization, every death is potentially preventable, should not occur, is important. When we look at cocaine in the context of the broader number of hospitalizations and deaths in terms of those that are caused by drugs, it is quite small. So we're talking, 1-2% of the total. Whereas for methamphetamine, as I mentioned, it's, 25% of treatment episodes. So I think a similar number for hospitalization. So to my mind, I'm not seeing the risk for displacement in terms of cocaine and methamphetamine. There is important to acknowledge that they are potentially different populations. Yes, so I guess, in our sample with people who regularly inject drugs, cocaine use is quite rare, but methamphetamine is essentially equivalent to or overtaken heroin. Whereas with the sample who use ecstasy, that's where all the cocaine use is happening and methamphetamine has dropped away.
Right.
So the other thing I flagged that's interesting around cocaine, and I didn't go into jurisdictional results, but with our sample of people who regularly use ecstasy, and as Shane mentioned, coming from the beautiful city of Hobart in Tasmania, previously when we talked about cocaine, it was capital cities and it was New South Wales and Victoria. When we look at our sample who regularly use ecstasy, I think it was, and Raimondo Bruno will be able to correct me, but something like 60% of the Tasmanian sample had used cocaine in the last 6 months. Now, anytime anyone talked about cocaine a few years back in Tasmania, you said, and when did you go to Melbourne? So it's seeing that trend across the other jurisdictions is quite interesting and suggests that it is potentially diffusing more across Australia, which is concerning.
Okay. We're just about to run out of time, but I've got one last question. Coke versus, I'll send this to either. The quick answer, is it possible to use Coke recreationally better than methamphetamine. This may actually refer back to this. It's very hard to use a drug more often that's less available. So the question is there a greater dependence potential for meth versus, or is it an artifact of the markets? So I've sent it. Amy, have you got any views on that?
Rebecca, is anything? I mean, with methamphetamine, we're predominantly talking about the crystal form in Australia, which
well, that's true, isn't it? It's really,
yeah.
If it was crack versus ice, it might be a different story.
Yeah,
but we're talking powder versus high potency. Would you agree with that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still struggling to understand the question reading it. It's got a lot of numbers in it, which is confusing for me.
No, that's a separate question. Don't look at the screen. Just listen to me. I told you this.
You had a flasher in front of you and there was cocaine and there was methamphetamine. Which one are you more like?
I think the question's been answered. I think the question is, if you look at a drug like crack cocaine, it's got credible dependence potential. We know that from Rebecca's work, the dependence potential of ice is greater than powder because it's 50%, say, versus 7% is one factor. So I think what that actually draws us attention to is really what you've been saying here, Rebecca, Amy, is the market. What the market, you've shown us the market, and I think it's an exceptional body of work. And, you know, it's state-of-the-art stuff, Amy. It's very impressive. I'd like to thank you very much. And Rebecca, thank you for your insights in this. I know you're involved in all this work, and it's always interesting to hear what you've got to say about these issues. So with that, I'll wish you all a good afternoon, and I would like to thank all of those in the audience who've contributed and listened to it today. We've got many comments coming and say, love the graphs. It was fantastic. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon and evening.
Bye-bye.